Hello, everyone. We are continuing in our 13th episode of Introduction to the Caribbean. There's one more to go, at least one more, maybe two. But today we're going to talk about Caribbean people and society. And we're using material from Owen Blewett's book, The Contemporary Caribbean Life, History, and Culture since 1945. So let's go take a look at people and society. So this is going to be mostly about the demographics of the Caribbean. And I've already introduced Owen Blewett, is a professor of history at Virginia State University. She's authored several books. I chose this book because it's short, it's very well written, and it's interdisciplinary. So we've been discussing things like the economy of the Caribbean, the international relations, the politics, the history, and now today we're going to talk about people and society. Our outline is urbanization, our major points: urbanization, migration, diversity, healthcare, and women. So there you see another picture of the Caribbean, another map. It's showing the population densities, the population growth rates. I think it's also a good colorful illustration of what exactly most people consider to be constituting the Caribbean. So you see that not only is it the islands, but some people consider it to be South Florida, and along the Caribbean coast, the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, along the coast of Central America, along the northern coast of Venezuela and Colombia, and the Guyanas. That's one interpretation. As you read at the beginning of the course, there are different ways of viewing actually which parts of this area actually constitute the Caribbean. In 2006, the population of the Caribbean islands was about 40 million. Despite high rates of immigration, there is a brain drain. A lot of people who get a higher education leave the Caribbean because of the lack of opportunities. The population has doubled since 1960, so that means it's doubled in my lifetime. Population numbers vary greatly from islands to island. Cuba, for example, has the largest population of the entire Caribbean with 11.3 million people. And several islands are very tiny, like Dominica and Grenada have populations of about 100,000. So population densities are high, with Barbados having the highest island density of 1,554 people per square mile. The overall natural increase in the Caribbean region is declining. It's still increasing, but not as rapidly. It's at 1.1% growth. I believe that's annually, compared to South America with 1.5 and Central America with 2 percentage points. The Dominican Republic and Haiti have high rates of natural increase. The total population of Hispaniola, the island, is about 17 million. So if it were one nation state, then it would be a larger population than Cuba, even though it has a smaller square miles. It's interesting. That was also true for Hispaniola before the arrival of the Spanish. It was the most densely populated island of the Taino and Arawak culture. Here's another graphic representation of the Caribbean population from 2017. And of course, it shows Cuba at 11.5 million, slightly larger than 2006. And you see various sizes of the islands. Urbanization. Urbanization is going on pretty much everywhere. But we'll talk for a moment about how it's playing out in the Caribbean. The HDI is the Human Development Index, which was developed by the United Nations as a way of measuring the quality of life or the well-being of people in various countries. It's improved steadily in most of the Caribbean islands. The United Nations realized that the well-being of people is not just about their income. So this is not measuring income only. It also measures life expectancy at birth, literacy and school enrollment, and gross domestic product per capita, GDP per capita. Barbados has the of the Caribbean. Barbados has the highest HDI rank. I have a lovely picture of Barbados there. I have not been there. I would love to go one of these days. But it ranks pretty high in the Human Development Index. It ranks at 29 in the countries of the world in terms of human development. So that's pretty good. The quality of the government is important, and the Barbados has a very stable, efficient government. Its success also derives from good foreign exchange, tourism, and offshore services, a relatively high investment in improving health and education. So Barbados would be a nice place to retire to, apparently. So also in terms of quality of life, there are 6 countries who are in the high rank, not as high as Barbados, but they're in the high ranking category for the HDI. That would be, in addition to Barbados, St. Kitts, Nevis, the Bahamas, Cuba, Trinidad, Tobago, and Antigua Barbuda, all rank fairly high. The Bahamas relies on tourism but spends less than Barbados on education and healthcare. Cuba ranks well on the HDI, and this may be a shock for some of my students, or you may doubt the veracity of these figures, but Cuba ranks well because the government spends high percentages of the GDP on education and healthcare. Trinidad and Tobago is a producer of oil and gas, and it's ranked at 54. This is a picture representing some of the poverty in Haiti, although you could see pictures just like this in Rio de Janeiro and Bogota, Colombia. These are in Rio de Janeiro. These are called favelas. They are basically ghetto areas built up the sides of mountains. Haiti is ranked at 153 and is the only Caribbean country in the low HDI group. Haiti's literacy levels and GDP per capita are low. Over 40% of the population of Haiti is under 15 years of age, and Haiti is the least able to support a growing young population. Haiti was the first island that won its independence, even before the Spanish-American republics, but it has since suffered. Haiti was occupied by United States troops twice in the 20th century, but it has not achieved political or economic stability. There's been many studies on why that is. My own reading would incline me to believe that Haiti was punished geopolitically by France, by the United States, by the Vatican, who held off and refused recognition for about 60 years. And in the case of France, they imposed a punitive reparations on Haiti after their war of revolution. Recently and tragically, there was another earthquake. This is fall of 2021, and a few weeks ago there was a devastating earthquake that affected Haiti. I think it was just as devastating as the one in 2010. It was just about the same on the Richter scale. Dependent Caribbean territories are not included in the Human Development Index because they're not independent nation states. So Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands were not ranked, even though they have a pretty good standard of living. The Dutch Antilles and Aruba are also part of the Kingdom of Netherlands, so they do not appear on the HDI, and neither does Great Britain's overseas territories such as Anguilla, Montserrat, the Cayman Islands, Turks and Caicos Islands. The dependencies do well. For example, the Cayman Islands' life expectancy at birth is about 80 years. And there's a picture of another place that would be nice to visit. Actually, this looks a little bit like the Florida Keys. Rapid urban development. The Caribbean has a long history of urban development, but since the end of World War II, the Caribbean islands have urbanized rapidly as people moved from the countrysides to the towns and the cities. In 1960, only about 38% of the people of the Caribbean lived in cities. By 2006, nearly 70% of Caribbean people were living in urban areas. As agriculture has declined, coastal urban centers have grown. Martinique and Puerto Rico are overwhelmingly urban. St. Lucia and Haiti are more rural. There's a picture of the Puerto Rico skyline, very beautiful. Prime cities. Primate cities act as political and economic centers, linking each island to the global network. Examples would include Santo Domingo, the capital of the Dominican Republic, 2 million inhabitants. San Juan, Puerto Rico, has 1 million inhabitants, which is nearly half of the population of the island, I think. Havana, Cuba, has 2.2 million inhabitants. The proportion of the total population living in primate cities can be very high. The number is 30% in San Juan, Puerto Rico. It's 40% of the total inhabitants of Trinidad live in Port of Spain. And 50% of all the people in the Bahamas, which is a large number of islands, 50% of the entire country lives in Nassau. There's a picture of Nassau, the Bahamas. Very appealing. We're all going to go traveling after this, right? There's Port of Spain, Trinidad. I've never been there, but I'd like to go someday. I've already shown San Juan, Puerto Rico. And here is Kingston, Jamaica. Migration. The Caribbean has always been a region associated with migration and circulation, starting with the Arawaks and the Caribs, who moved to the islands from the mainland of South America. And they kept expanding and moving from island to island. The Caribbean today is an area of introduced peoples. Almost the entire indigenous population died out because of disease, because of brutality, because of forced enslavement, a number of factors, and an entirely non-native population was brought in, primarily Europeans and Africans. The Europeans mostly came freely. Some Europeans were actually kidnapped and brought forcibly as contract workers, as indentured servants. But the majority of Europeans moved in order to make their wealth in the Caribbean. At least, I hope that's a true statement. There have been also a lot of Europeans since World War II, actually in the early part of the 19th century, who moved as laborers, as well as Asians and Chinese, Japanese. Asian migrants, mainly from India and China, were added in the 19th century as a wave of indentured laborers arrived. Of course, most Africans were brought forcibly and unwillingly as forced labor. The Caribbean islands are one of the most diverse populations in the world because of this mixture from Europe, Africa, indigenous, Asia, India. It creates a very diverse population. A mix of African, European, and Asian ethnic heritages. Migration within the Caribbean has been quite common. In the early 20th century, migration was especially common among the islands. Cane cutters would move from Jamaica and Haiti to go to Cuba or the Dominican Republic to cut cane during the peak season. When the Panama Canal was being built, Barbadians and Jamaicans and others moved to Panama to earn money working on the Panama Canal. Some stayed, and some of them stayed in other parts of Central America working on banana plantations. The oil industry also moved people around. People moved from Martinique and Grenada to Trinidad to work in Trinidad in the oil industry, also to the ABC islands of Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao. And so migration within the Caribbean was not unusual. Out-migration is also common, and more so recently. Since the 1960s, most out-migration from the Caribbean has been overwhelmingly to the United States. This is what's called the brain drain. Of course, it's not always about highly educated people. It could also be people fleeing desperate economic circumstances or political circumstances. There are over 5 million of Caribbean origin residing in the United States. Puerto Ricans have come to the United States in large numbers because they're citizens and they have the right to enter into the territorial United States without any problems. Over 2 million are from Puerto Rico, and the U.S. citizens are not considered, and as U.S. citizens are not considered foreign migrants. New York is the #1 destination for Puerto Ricans. There's also a large number of Cubans in the United States. About 1 million Cubans claiming political asylum have migrated to the U.S. since the Revolution. There's a great PBS documentary series about this called Latino Americans, Foreigners in Their Own Land, or Strangers in Their Own Land. And it also talks about the Dominican wave that came to New York, as well as the Mexican immigrants, which we're not going to cover in this chapter because they're not considered the Caribbean unless they're along the Gulf of Mexico. The Caribbean is one of the most diverse regions of the world with multi-ethnic and multilinguistic societies. Europeans from Spain, France, Netherlands, Britain, Denmark, and Portugal, plus people from Syria, Lebanon, Asians, Chinese, and Indians. The Afro-Caribbean population is the largest group. Languages spoken include Spanish. 60% of the Caribbean people speak Spanish. 16% speak English. 22% speak French. 2% speak Dutch. Papiamento and Creole dialects, including Creole with a K, is how this author spells the specific Creole dialect of Haiti. Race and skin color are complicated in the Caribbean. There are complicated hierarchies or human perceptions of the degrees of whiteness, which continue to be associated with wealth and power. In Martinique, Creole whites, known as Beques, control much of the island's wealth. The poor and underprivileged are usually black, although wealth or education can whiten. In the Caribbean, there are many shades of skin color. Some commentators suggest that in recent years, skin pigmentation is becoming less important as a social class indicator. There's a chapter in James Michener's book, Caribbean, towards the end of the book, I think, about Barbadian society. In fact, there's 2 chapters that deal with Barbados and illustrates how nuanced and complicated the various shades of color and degrees of social status are in Barbados. In the United States, it's kind of binary, white or black. And most people who have some degree of color would be considered black in the United States. There's no category for mulatto in the United States. But in the Caribbean, there's all these gradations of color and social status. In the Dominican Republic, lighter-skinned people of European descent are the primary landowners. The darker-skinned people tend to be the urban dwellers and the rural poor. This type of divide is still common in most islands. Nevertheless, racial discrimination is decreasing over time. Even in Cuba, where the government has actively pursued anti-discrimination policies, the poorest in society are still usually black. One of the books we're reading in our graduate course on the Caribbean is by Danielle Cleland, who was a FIU professor and a person of color. She did a very deep dive into research in Cuba on perceptions of racism and color, and she believes that racism is still present in Cuba, much stronger than what the Cuban government or most of the Cuban people would admit. Poverty in the Caribbean. Great gulfs separate the rich from the poor in the Caribbean. This is also true in Latin America in general. Although in terms of world conditions, the region, with the exception of Haiti, is relatively well off, there are still pockets of deep poverty in many islands. In Puerto Rico, it is estimated that over half of the population lives in poor conditions and depends on assistance. In Trinidad, the figure is about 20%, and this is an oil-producing nation. Of course, Venezuela is also an oil-producing nation, and there's still a large amount of poverty there. Many Caribbean people live in poor housing with unreliable services where the power cuts are common. And that's all for today. I hate to end on a negative note, so let's go back to the top. Now let's leave it on one of these lovely cities. Thank you very much. Next time we'll be talking about the culture of the Caribbean. That's will be one of my favorite chapters. Music, literature, art. So I'll see you then. This is Joseph Holbrook signing off. I'm also posting some book reviews about the Caribbean on my YouTube channel. So if you're interested, look for those. Take care.